Listen closely. Beyond the shrieking of the Geller fields and the chanting of the tech priests, there's a sound the galaxy has forgotten. It isn't the mechanical roar of an engine or the psychic scream of a dying psyker. It is a heartbeat. Slow, heavy. Each thud vibrates through the very foundations of materium. Something has slipped through the cracks of the warp. Not a demon, not a splinter of Hive fleet, but a raw, unadulterated constant of rage. It is a gamma-irradiated ghost, a creature of a logic that does not belong to the God Empire or the ruinous powers. Below us, the planet of Gork's Grin chokes under the smog of a billion scrap heaps. The Orks believe they are the pinnacle of violence. They believe their Wyak is the ultimate expression of the green tide. They are wrong. As the meteor, if you can even call that slab of pulsing metal a meteor, tears through the atmosphere, the Orks look up and laugh. They think a new god has come to play. But as the dust settles and the first roar echoes across the scrap wastes, the laughter stops. What is a monster to a race that prides itself on being monstrous? What happens when the strongest there is meets the biggest and the meanest? The void did not scream when it tore. It groaned, a sound like rusted iron grinding against the silk of reality. We watched from the monitoring spires of Gork's Grin as a streak of unnatural light, not the flickering violet of the warp, but a searing, sickly emerald, clove the atmosphere in twain. It hit the scrap waste with the force of an exterminatus light, vaporizing a square kilometer of rusted dakajets and corrugated iron shanties. In the crater's heart, there was no demon, no xenos biopod, just a man. A small, shivering creature of flesh and bone named Bruce Banner, clutching his tattered rags against a wind that smelled of promethium and ancient rot. To any other race, he would be a scavenger to be ignored. To the Orks, he was a curiosity. And in this galaxy, curiosity is merely a precursor to cruelty. A mob of Bernie boys, led by a scarred knob named Scarteeth, were the first to descend the crater's lip. They didn't see a threat. They saw a runt that had fallen from the sky, a trophy to be prodded with a chopper. I watched through the vid thief's grainy lens as Scarteeth drove a jagged blade into the man's shoulder, a casual act of violence intended to hear the creature's death rattle. But the rattle never came. Instead, the air around the man began to hum. It was a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth of every orc in the pit. The blood dripping from the wound didn't run red. It pulsed with neon luminescence, thick and hot, sizzling against the toxic soil. Banner's eyes didn't plead for mercy. They turned a shade of green so deep it made the orc's own skin look pale and sickly by comparison. The transformation was not the elegant evolution of a tyrannid or the surgical augmentation of Mechanicus. It was a violent, biological insurrection. Bones didn't just grow. They detonated outward, snapping and resetting in a frantic rhythm of wet thuds and cracking calcium. The Orks, usually emboldened by the prospect of scrap, took a collective step back. They recognized the scent of a predator, but this was something alien, a rage that lacked the jovial anarchy of Gork and Mork. This was a cold, suffocating fury that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the air. As the man vanished beneath slabs of hyperdense muscle, the crater floor began to liquefy under the sheer weight of the entity's newfound mass. The runt was gone. In his place stood a mountain of jade-colored spite. Scarteeth, driven by the instinctive stupidity that defines his race, roared a challenge and swung his power claw. It was a strike that could have decapitated a space marine, yet the beast simply caught the mechanical pincer in a hand the size of a kilocan's torso. There was no struggle. With a flick of a wrist, the Hulk reduced the master-crafted orc weaponry to a shower of sparks and shrapnel. Then came the roar. It wasn't a whack. It was a tectonic shift made vocal, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the soul. The pressure wave shattered the goggles of the surrounding boys, blinding them with their own glass. In that moment, the Orks realized they weren't the greenest things on this world anymore. What followed was not a battle. It was a harvesting. The Hulk moved with a speed that defied his bloated geometry, a blurring shadow of emerald death. He did not use weapons. He used the environment, swinging one ork like a club to pulverize a dozen more. The Bernie boys unleashed their liquid flame, bathing the creature in a 2,000-degree inferno. The Hulk simply inhaled the fire, his skin glowing like a forge heart, his cellular regeneration outpacing the chemical burns before the soot could even settle. As he stood atop a pile of broken xenos, the sky itself seemed to darken, responding to the psychic vacuum of his anger. The first seeds of the nightmare had been sown in the scrap fields. What is a soul worth in a galaxy that has already sold its own? On Gork's Grin, the currency of the soul had just been replaced by the weight of a fist. The aftermath of the crater's slaughter did not bring silence. It brought a hum, a psychic resonance that began to ripple across the scrap shanties of Gork's Grin. Orks do not feel fear as humans do, but they possess an apex predator's instinct for the big one. Word spread through the spores, carried by fleeing grots and the dying gas of Bernie boys. Something bigger than Knob, greener than a war boss, and angrier than Gork himself had arrived. Thousands of Greenskins began to migrate toward the impact site, drawn not by duty, but by a gravitational pull of sheer violence. They found the Hulk sitting amidst the wreckage of Estampa's leg, not panting, not tired, but radiating a heat that shimmered the very air. He wasn't hunting them yet. He was waiting. His massive jaw sent a line of permanent disgust for this filthy, clamorous world. Among the gathering throng was Zogwart's apprentice, a weird boy known as Fizrak the Frazzled. While the boys brandished their shooters, Fizrak stared with his third eye wide open. To a psyker, the Hulk did not look like a biological entity. He looked like a localized collapse of materium. There was no warp taint on him, no oily residue of the dark gods, but rather a blinding, radioactive sun where a soul should be. Fizrak screamed, green lightning leaping from his copper staff, as he realized the truth. The Wayak field, the collective psychic energy of the Orks, was beginning to latch onto the Hulk. They wanted him to be their god, and the Hulk's own bottomless rage was acting as a lightning rod, grounding the Orks' psychic noise into physical mass. The local war boss, a mountain of scarred blubber and cybernetics named Ghazghkull, pushed through the crowd, eager to claim the great green shiny. He didn't see a disaster. He saw the ultimate trophy. Ghazghkull challenged the Hulk with a roar that shook the soot from the sky, firing his twin-link big shooters point-blank into the Hulk's chest. The heavy-caliber rounds buried themselves in the jade muscle, only to be spat back out as the wound sealed instantly. The Hulk didn't even flinch. He looked at the war boss with a terrifying, weary intelligence. He didn't want their throne. He didn't want their war. He simply wanted the screaming to stop. And in his mind, the only way to find silence was to break everything that made a sound. The fight lasted less than 3 seconds. The Hulk bridged the gap between them with a leap that cracked the planet's crust, landing on Ghazghkull with the weight of a falling moon. He didn't use a blade. He simply took the Warboss's massive, hydraulic-driven head in both hands and applied pressure. The sound of ceramite and bone collapsing was like a thunderclap. The surrounding Orks didn't charge in revenge. They froze. In Ork society, size is the ultimate mandate of heaven. By killing the biggest Ork on the planet, without breaking a sweat, the Hulk hadn't just won a fight. He had accidentally ascended the hierarchy. The Jade Beast was now, by all rights of Xenos law, the master of the Wayak. A strange, terrifying synchronicity began to take hold. The Orks dropped their weapons, not in surrender, but in a primitive, ecstatic awe. They began to chant, a low, rhythmic thumping of feet that echoed the Hulk's own heavy pulse. The big green, the big green. The Hulk looked around at the sea of emerald faces, his nostrils flaring. For the first time, the Bruce Banner fragment deep inside felt a sickening realization. On Earth, he was a monster to be hunted. Here, he was a king to be worshipped. This was a nightmare of a different kind, a world that didn't want to cure him, but wanted to be just like him. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? As the Hulk let out a roar of frustration, 10,000 Orks roared back in perfect, horrific harmony. The peace of Gork's Grin was a lie, A momentary breath held before a scream. The Hulk did not want a kingdom. Yet the Orks had built him one out of the corpses of his enemies and the rusted hulls of fallen titans. They followed him like a green shadow, a parasitic devotion that fed on his every movement. To Bruce Banner, trapped in the attic of his own mind, the sensory input was a cacophony of madness. The smell of ozone, the oily stench of Ork sweat, and the constant, rhythmic chanting of his name. When the Hulk tried to flee into the waste, the Orks followed, thinking it was a charge. When he struck out in anger, they cheered, thinking it was a sermon. He was a prisoner of his own legend, locked in a scrapyard that stretched for continents. The siege began not from without, but from within the ranks of those who felt slighted by this Jade god. A rival coalition of speed freaks and big mechs, led by the mechanical genius Murdo, viewed the Hulk as a biological fluke that needed to be dissected. They descended upon the Hulk's camp, a flattened wasteland of pulverized metal, with a fleet of killer cans and death dreads. The air turned black with the soot of primitive engines. Murdo didn't want to worship. He wanted to see what made the green engine tick. He unleashed a barrage of shock attack guns, tearing small holes in reality itself to teleport snotlings directly into the Hulk's bloodstream. It was a level of scientific cruelty that finally broke the Hulk's simmering restraint. The first killer that reached him didn't even get to fire its big shoulda. The Hulk moved with a predatory grace that mocked the clunky hydraulics of the Ork walkers. He didn't just punch the machine. He reached into the chassis, his fingers tearing through reinforced plasteel like it was wet parchment, and dragged the screaming pilot out through the viewport. He used the pilot as a projectile, hurled with such velocity that it pierced the fuel tank of a nearby truck, triggering a chain reaction of explosions. The Hulk stood in the center of the blossoming fire, his skin absorbing the heat, his muscles expanding until the veins on his chest looked like thick, throbbing power cables. He wasn't just fighting anymore. He was dismantling the very idea of mechanical superiority. As the battle intensified, a strange phenomenon began to manifest. The Orks watching from the sidelines, the ones who had accepted the Hulk as their master, began to feel a surge of energy unlike any Wyak they had ever experienced. It wasn't the manic joy of Gork or the cunning of Mork. It was a heavy, crushing weight that made their muscles swell and their eyes leak green radiance. The gamma radiation bleeding from the Hulk was being filtered through the Orks' own latent psychic field. They weren't just fighting better, they were changing. Their choppa began to glow with a faint jade light, and their laughter died away, replaced by a cold, focused brutality that mirrored the monster they worshipped. By the time the sun set behind the smog banks, the siege was over. The scrapyard was a graveyard of twisted walkers and melted iron. The Hulk stood over the remains of Murdo's mega armor, his breathing slow and heavy, a sound like a forged bellows. He looked at his hands, stained with black oil and green ichor, and then at the thousands of Orks who now stood in terrifying, disciplined silence. They weren't cheering anymore. They were waiting for a command. Banner's voice whispered in the dark, "Is this what we are? A god for monsters? What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own?" The Hulk didn't answer. He simply picked up a jagged piece of a Ghazghkull and crushed it into dust, realizing that on this world, the only way to be left alone was to destroy everything that could. The air on Gork's Grin had changed. It no longer tasted of simple soot and promethium, but of ionized copper and something older. Fizrak the Frazzled, the warp head who had first glimpsed the Hulk's true nature, could no longer hold the pressure within his skull. To an Ork psyker, the warp is a great green sea, a turbulent ocean of Gork and Mork's laughter. But as Fizrak approached the Hulk, the sea went silent. The warphead's copper staff glowed with a sickly, pulsating emerald light that didn't flicker like psychic fire. It burned steady and cold. The other Orks gave him a wide berth, sensing that the weirdness was no longer under control of their gods. Fizrak wasn't just hearing the voices of Gork and Mork anymore. He was hearing a low, tectonic hum that whispered of a place beneath the world, a place of jade doors and infinite, patient anger. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't name, Fizrak reached out a withered, three-finger hand to touch the Hulk's massive calf. The moment contact was made, the scrap waste vanished. The thousands of chanting orcs, the smoldering gargantuls, the very sky itself, all were stripped away. Fizrak's mind was dragged into the green door, the metaphysical heart of the Gamma-80. He didn't see a man or a beast. He saw a titanic, multidimensional engine of destruction that spanned the birth and death of universes. He saw the one below all, the shadow aspect of the divine that fed on the rage of every sentient soul. It was a vision that would have shattered a human mind instantly, but an Ork's psyche is built for the blunt force of the impossible. Fizrak didn't break. He simply changed. Inside the vision, the weird boy saw the great green gods Gork and Mork standing like twin mountain ranges on the horizon of the warp. Usually, they were brawling, an eternal duel of brutal cunning and cunning brutality. But now they were still. They were staring down at the Hulk, this alien intruder, with a look that wasn't hostility, but recognition. They saw in the Hulk a mirror of their own primal essence, but stripped of the humor, stripped of the fun of the fight. The Hulk was a pure whack, violence without the joy, power without the purpose. As Fizrak watched, a bridge of jade light began to form between the Hulk's soul and the feet of the Ork gods. The gamma radiation was not just a poison. It was a new dialect of divinity, and the Orks were learning how to speak it. Fizrak's eyes suddenly burst, not with blood, but with beams of pure, unadulterated gamma energy. He began to levitate, his body elongating, his skin sloughing off to reveal muscle that was denser and darker than any Orkoid biology should allow. He became a conduit, a living voxcaster for the entity within the Hulk. He spoke, but the voice wasn't his. It was a chorus of 1 billion angry souls, a sound that cracked the goggles of every Ork in the vicinity. He proclaimed the new era of the Jade Sun, a prophecy where the Orks would no longer fight for scrap or for sport, but to satisfy a hunger that could never be filled. The Waak was evolving into something the galaxy had never seen, a crusade of absolute, humorless extinction. When the connection finally snapped, Fizrak fell to ground. No longer a weird boy, but something the Orks called a glowgrot, a radioactive husk that breathed out green fog. The Hulk looked down at the shivering shaman, his eyes narrowing. For a fleeting second, the Bruce Banner within felt a surge of pure horror. He hadn't just landed on a planet of monsters. He had become their focal point, their Saint of the Shards. The Orks began to paint their faces with the radioactive mud from the Hulk's footprints, their primitive minds now fixed on a single, terrifying goal, to spread this new green to the stars. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? As the Hulk turned his back on the worshipping masses, he realized the Orks weren't following him anymore. They were becoming him. The planet of Gork's Grin was no longer a chaotic sprawl of bickering clans. It had become a singular, heaving lung, breathing in rhythm with the Hulk's own simmering pulse. The Orks had stopped their petty infighting, a feat that defied 10,000 years of xenos history. They worked with silent, terrifying industry, tearing down their idols of Gork and Mork to build something far more utilitarian, a throne of fused adamantium and shattered titan parts. The Hulk sat upon this jagged peak of industry, not out of pride, but because it was the only place where the ground didn't immediately liquefy under its sheer density. He watched as the Orks brought him tides, not gold or grain, but the broken weapons of their enemies and the radioactive cores of hijacked plasma engines. They fed his anger with the tools of war, hoping to see the great green one unleash the fire they so desperately craved. In the shadows of the scrap heaps, Bruce Banner found a strange, hollow peace. In the relative silence between the Hulk's outbursts, the scientists realized that the Orks were, in their own crude way, the most honest society he had ever encountered. They didn't lie about their nature. They didn't wrap their atrocities in a flag of progress or the mantle of the greater good. They were monsters, and they embraced it. For a man who had spent his life running from the beast within, there was a seductive, poisonous comfort in being among creatures who viewed his curse as a blessing. But that peace was a delusion. Every time an Ork knelt before him, the gamma saturation and the air increased, warping the very flora and fauna of the world into aggressive, bioluminescent nightmares. Banner wasn't just living among monsters. He was terraforming the world into a mirror of his own internal hell. The tipping point came when a massive Gargant production facility, a cathedral of scrap and soot, failed to produce a machine that met the Hulk's perceived standards. The Hulk, driven by a sudden, inexplicable surge of Banner's old architectural knowledge and his own raw power, didn't just destroy the facility. He redesigned it through violence. He tore through the massive, walking effigies of the Ork gods, ripping the unstable power plants from their bellies and slamming them into the earth. The resulting explosions didn't kill the workers. The gamma surge merely ascended them. The Orks within the blast radius grew to twice their size, their skin hardening into jade-colored chitin. The Hulk had become a world breaker, not just by treading upon the soil, but by rewriting the laws of its production. The tithe soon extended beyond the physical. The Orks began to sacrifice their own unworthy to Hulk, casting those too weak or too ungreen into the radioactive pits that now pockmarked the landscape. The Hulk tried to stop it, his roar echoing across the waste in a plea for the slaughter to end, but the Orks misinterpreted his fury as a demand for more. They were caught in a feedback loop of gamma-fueled zealotry. The Hulk's presence was a literal drug to them. The closer they stood to him, the stronger they felt, and the more they were willing to bleed to stay in his light. The Big Green was no longer a leader. He was an environmental catastrophe that the Orks had mistaken for a messiah. By the end of the solar month, Gork's Grin had been stripped of its traditional Orkoid character. The red-painted trucks and yellow-checkered banners were gone, replaced by a monochromatic landscape of pulsing emerald. The Hulk stood at the apex of his mountain, looking out over a world that was now his in every horrific sense of the word. He was the ultimate war boss, a king of a graveyard that refused to stay dead. Banner's voice, now a thin, ghostly wail in the back of the Hulk's mind, asked the final question. What have we built? What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? The Hulk looked up at the stars, his eyes burning with a light that could be seen from the next system over. He wasn't just a prisoner of the planet anymore. The planet was a prisoner of him. The void around Gork's Grin shimmered as the explorator fleet Omnisia's logic exited the warp. To the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the planet did not register as a xenos stronghold, but as a biological impossibility. Their sensors screamed of a gamma signature so pure, so concentrated, it defied the STC records of known stellar phenomena. Muggle's biologist Vol peered through his multi-lens oculars, his mechanical heart pumps whirring in rhythmic agitation. He did not see a monster. He saw a miracle of spontaneous evolution, a font of infinite kinetic energy housed within a carbon-based frame. The decree was absolute. The specimen was to be contained, its genetic code mapped, and its power harvested for the glory of Mars. The Jade Beast was not a threat to be purged, but an asset to be cataloged. The descent was a masterpiece of cold, machine precision. Macrolanders touched down amidst the scrap fields, deploying phalanxes of Skitarii rangers who moved with the synchronized grace of a ticking clock. Their rad carbines hummed, but the radiation that usually withered flesh seemed to have no effect here. In fact, the further they marched into the emerald fog, the more their bionics struggled. The Hulk's presence was a localized electromagnetic storm, a biostatic that gnawed at the holy machine spirits of the Mechanicus. Muggles Vol, watching from the safety of Command Throne, felt a rare flicker of data-driven dread. The atmosphere was so thick with gamma resonance that his logic circuits began to loop, interpreting the Hulk's distant roar as a corrupted binary hymn. When the Hulk finally emerged from the smog to face these puny metal men, he did not charge. He looked at the Skitarii with a weary, almost pitying intelligence. To him, they were just another version of the soldiers who had hunted him through the deserts of New Mexico, men who had traded their humanity for better weapons. Muggles Vol unleashed the constraint protocol. For Onager Doomcrawlers fired localized graviton beams, attempting to pin the Hulk to the planet's crust with the weight of a dying star. The ground beneath the Hulk's feet shattered, sinking 10 meters into the bedrock. For a second, the machine won. The Hulk was forced to one knee, his muscles groaning under the artificial gravity, his skin turning a bruised, dark violet. But the Mechanicus had made a fatal error. They had quantified the Hulk's strength based on his current state, forgetting that his power is a reactive variable. As the graviton beams intensified, the Hulk's anger, fueled by the familiar sting of containment, surpassed the machine's capacity to hold it. He didn't just stand up, he pushed back against the very fabric of the gravitational field. With a sound like the sky tearing open, the Hulk clapped his hands together. The resulting sonic boom didn't just shatter the Skitarii. It inverted the graviton projectors, causing the dune crawlers to implode into fist-sized spheres of scrap. The Muggos watched in horror as his perfect logic was dismantled by a creature that treated the laws of physics as mere suggestions. The intervention ended in a slaughter that even the Orks found proper. The Hulk tore through the Mechanicus lines like a landslide through a glass house. He didn't just kill the tech priests. He crushed their bionics into the dirt, stripping away the metal to find the shivering, terrified flesh beneath. It was a brutal reminder that no matter how much steel you hide behind, the meat is always weak. As the last Macrolander attempted to flee, the Hulk leapt, catching the massive vessel by its landing gear and dragging it back down to the screaming earth. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? Muggos Vol's final data log was a single, frantic line of binary. The green is not biology. The green is a verdict. The sky over Gork's Grin did not just darken, it curdled. A fleet of cruisers, welded together by nothing but prayer and primitive magnetism, blotted out the jade sun. From the flagship Killwrecker, a drop pod the size of a cathedral plummeted toward the scrap fields. This was no mere challenger. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of the Wyak, stepped out into the emerald haze, his mega armor hissing with the steam of 1,000 genocides. He did not come with a roar, but with a heavy, purposeful tread. He looked at the Hulk, this anomaly, this jade god. And he didn't see a deity. He saw the ultimate fight. Ghazghkull's mechanical word, locking onto the Hulk's chest. He spoke a single word that vibrated through the collective psychic field of every Ork on the planet. Mine. The duel began with a collision that shattered the tectonic plates beneath the scrap wastes. It was the meeting of two different philosophies of rage. Ghazghkull fought with the blessed fury of Gork and Mork, a tactical, brutal efficiency honed across 1,000 war zones. The Hulk fought with the raw, entropic power of a dying star. Every time Ghazghkull's massive power claw tore into the Hulk's side, the wounds didn't just heal, they vented gamma fire that melted the prophet's armor. Yet, Ghazghkull did not falter. He was a creature of pure belief, and as the billion Orks watching began to chant his name, the prophet grew. The Wyak field was feeding both of them now, a feedback loop of green energy that threatened to turn the very atmosphere into a plasma storm. For hours, the two titans traded blows that could have leveled cities. Ghazghkull used his twin-link big shooters to peel the skin from the Hulk's ribs, only for the Hulk to respond by grabbing the barrels and knotting them like wet straw. The Hulk was faster, stronger, and infinitely more durable, but Ghazghkull had something the Hulk lacked, a joy for the struggle. The prophet laughed as his blood sprayed the dirt, his cackling defiance acting as a psychic anchor that prevented the Hulk from simply obliterating him. The Hulk, conversely, was growing more frustrated. He wanted the fight to end. Ghazghkull wanted it to last forever. It was a stalemate of wills that began to tear a hole in the materium itself. As the Hulk's anger reached a new, catastrophic peak, his skin began to pulse with a light so bright it blinded the surrounding mobs. He didn't just punch Ghazghkull, he hit him with the weight of his entire irradiated soul. The prophet's mega armor shattered, the thick adamantium plates peeling away like scorched paper. Ghazghkull was thrown across the horizon, skipping over the scrap heaps like a stone across a pond. But as the Hulk moved in for the kill, he stopped. He saw the Orks. They weren't cheering for Ghazghkull anymore, nor were they cheering for him. They were simply vibrating, their bodies swelling and distorting as they drank in the overflowing energy of the duel. They were becoming a carpet of jade-colored meat, losing their individuality to the sheer radiation. Ghazghkull rose from the wreckage of a burned-out truck, his organic half a mass of gore, his mechanical eyes sparking. He looked at the Hulk, and, for the first time, the Prophet felt a sliver of something that wasn't triumph. He saw that the Hulk wasn't a warrior to be beaten. He was a catastrophe to be survived. The duel hadn't settled who was the best. It had only proven that when two infinities collide, there is nothing left to rule. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? As the two Greenskins stood staring at each other amidst the ruins of a world they had both broken, the rift above them began to bleed a new, sickening color. The war of two Greens had no victor, only a witness. The stalemate between the Prophet and the Beast acted as a catalyst. A psychic spark dropped into a pool of irradiated promethium. The Wyak field, usually a chaotic tide of Orkoid belief, began to stabilize into something far more structured and infinitely more lethal. It was no longer a mere psychic aura. It had become a physical contagion. The gamma radiation bleeding from the Hulk's pores acted as a carrier wave for the Ork's latent reality warping abilities. Across the planet, the very spores that birthed the Greenskin race were being rewritten. The new generation of Orks emerging from the fungal pits didn't crawl out. They erupted. They were hulking, hairless monstrosities of dark jade muscle, their bones reinforced with organic calcium carbonate, their minds linked by a singular, cold-blooded frequency of rage. This Gamma Wyak did not manifest as a usual disorganized mob of shouting warriors. It was a silent, shifting wall of emerald meat. The Hulk Orks, as the fleeing grots called them, possessed a terrifying, hive-minded focus. They didn't care for trophies or loot. They cared only for the burn. Their very presence caused the vegetation to blacken and the rocks to crack. As they marched, the air around them ionized, creating localized lightning storms that danced between their massive, bulging shoulders. Even Ghazghkull, watching from the heights of a scrap tower, realized the horror he had unleashed. His boys were no longer his. They were extensions of the anomaly, a biological army that had traded its soul for strength that was never meant to be contained in flesh. The transformation was most evident in the beast snaggers who had attempted to hunt the Hulk during the duel. They had become jade stalkers, their mounts. The squigs, mutating into multi-eyed, gamma-burping horrors with skin like tank plating. These creatures moved with synchronized, rhythmic thud that echoed the Hulk's own heartbeat. When they encountered a pocket of unmutated Orks, there was no recruitment, only assimilation. The Gamma Wyak consumed everything in its path, pulling the life force from the environment to fuel its exponential growth. The planet of Gork's Grin was no longer an Ork World. It was a giant, pulsing lung of green radiation, exhaling a psychic signal that could be heard across the sector. Inside the Hulk, the struggle had reached a fever pitch. Bruce Banner could feel the billions of newly forged minds reaching out to him, try to find a central consciousness to lead them. They were a choir of a billion screams, all begging for the same thing: smash. The Hulk didn't want to lead them, but his own biology was traitorous. Every time he struck the ground in frustration, the Gamma Wyak grew stronger, feeding on his kinetic output. He was a battery for a war he never declared. He realized with a sickening clarity that he couldn't leave. If he took to the stars, he would simply carry this plague to the rest of the galaxy. He was the patient zero of a new kind of extinction. By the time the moon rose, the entire horizon was a sea of jade light. Millions of Hulk Orks stood in perfect, terrifying formation, their eyes fixed on the Hulk's silhouette. They weren't waiting for a speech. They were waiting for the big green to move so they could follow. The traditional anarchy of the Orks had been replaced by a singular, monolithic will. The galaxy has seen many threats: the Tyranid Hive, the Necron Legions, the Chaos Waste, but it had never seen a force that combined the reproductive speed of the Ork with the indestructible, scaling power of the Hulk. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? As the first of the mutated cruisers ignited its engines, the Jade Sun didn't just rise. It prepared to spread. The immaterium is a realm of noise, a screaming, chaotic ocean of every emotion ever felt by a sentient soul. But as the Gamma Wyak prepared to breach the veil, a great silence fell across the warp. It began as a cold spot, a localized dead zone where the laughter of thirsting gods simply ceased. Khorne, the blood god, looked out from his throne of skulls and saw a rage that did not belong to him. It was a fury that lacked the ritual of the blade or the honor of the kill. It was a biological entropy that sought only to end the cycle of conflict by being the last thing standing. Khorne reached out a hand of brass to claim this new champion, to bind the Hulk in chains of red iron. But his fingers passed through the Jade entity as if it were a ghost. The Hulk's anger was too dense, too self-contained, to be flavored by the warp. He was a black hole in the middle of a psychic storm. Sench, the weaver of fates, found his infinite threads tangled and scorched. He tried to calculate the Hulk's future, to find a path where the beast could be used as a pawn in the great game. But every thread he touched turned to ash. The Hulk was a biological constant, a creature whose only destiny was to be the strongest there is. There was no ambition to subvert, no hope to corrupt. In the presence of the Jade Beast, the architect of fate found himself blind, staring into a green sun that burned away the complexity of his schemes. Even Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, found his most potent poxes rejected. The Hulk's cellular regeneration was so violent, so frantic, that no plague could find purchase. The grandfather watched in silent, bloated fascination as the Hulk's body healed faster than the rock could take root. On the surface of Gork's Grin, the Hulk felt the weight of these cosmic gazes. He looked at the sky and saw the warp bleeding through, the colors of four gods swirling like oil on water. For the first time, he felt the loneliness of his own godhood. He was a being of two worlds, yet a citizen of neither. The Orks continued their silent, rhythmic chanting, a sound that now resonated with the frequencies of the one below all. They didn't want the blessings of the chaos gods anymore. Why worship a god of blood when you can follow a god of bone-breaking? Why seek the rod of Nurgle when you can possess the immortality of the Gamma Core? The Hulk had effectively starved the warp of the Ork psychic energy, redirecting the Wyak, field into a closed loop that fed only him. Then came the golden light. From across the light years, the Emperor of mankind, tethered to his golden throne, turned his psychic eye toward the anomaly. In that frozen moment, Banner felt a presence that was both a fire and a frost. The Emperor did not see a monster. He saw a tragedy. He saw a man who had become a weapon, and a weapon that had become a world. There was no judgment, only a profound telepathic weariness. The Emperor knew that if the Hulk remained, the Orks would eventually consume the galaxy in a way the Tyranids never could. But he also knew that the Hulk could not be destroyed by any blade in the Imperial arsenal. The silence of the gods was not a sign of peace. It was the indrawn breath of a universe that had realized it was trapped in a room with a ticking bomb. The Hulk let out a roar that was neither a challenge nor a cry for help. It was a rejection. He rejected the Orks' worship. He rejected the Chaos God's interest. He rejected the Emperor's pity. He stood alone in the center of a galaxy that had already sold its soul, a creature of pure, unadulterated no. The Orks reacted to this roar by bowing their heads even lower, their jade skin pulsing in time with his fury. The tragedy was complete. The more the Hulk tried to push the universe away, the more it clung to him. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? As the stars themselves seemed to dim in the face of his radiance, the Hulk realized that to save the galaxy, he would have to destroy the very world that had made him its king. The end game of Gork's Grin was not written in the annals of history, but in the sudden, agonizing death of its own gravity. The Hulk had become a critical mass of biological and psychic energy that the planet's mantle could no longer support. As he stood at the apex of his scrap throne, the very core of the world began to liquefy, turning into a pressurized soup of molten iron and gamma radiation. The Orks did not flee. They stood in their millions, their jade chitinous bodies vibrating with frequency that shattered their own bones. They were ecstatic. To them, this was the ultimate Y-act, the moment where they would finally transcend the meat and become the explosion they had worshipped. The Hulk felt the pressure building in his own chest, a scream that had been trapped since the day of the Gamma Bomb, now seeking a world-sized exit. In the final seconds, Bruce Banner's consciousness flickered to the surface one last time. He didn't see the monsters or the machines. He saw a way to end the cycle. He realized that the Orks' devotion was a tether, and as long as he existed as their king, they would remain a plague upon the stars. He pushed his anger past the point of survival, past the point of regeneration. He didn't fight the planet's collapse. He accelerated it. He reached down and drove his fist into the bedrock, dumping his entire infinite reserve of gamma potential into the planet's failing core. It was a suicidal world to save a galaxy that didn't even know it was in danger. The sky turned a shade of green so bright it erased the stars, a jade sun born from the wreckage of a scrapyard. The detonation was silent at first, a vacuum of light that swallowed Gork's Grin whole. Then came the shockwave. It tore through the materium and the immaterium alike, a cleansing fire of emerald radiation that cauterized the warp rift above the planet. The hive fleets in the neighboring sectors felt the tremor in the synapse. The Necrons in their stasis tombs registered a tectonic shift in the galactic map. The millions of Hulk Orks were not vaporized. They were integrated into the blast, their physical forms rendered into a fine, glowing dust that scattered across the void. The Jade Y-act ended not with conquest, but with a supernova of pure, unadulterated Hulk. When the light finally faded, Gork's Grin was gone. In its place was a beautiful, terrifying nebula of emerald gas, a green comet that would drift through the segmentum for millennia. The Orks who remained in the galaxy would look up at that glowing scar in the sky and feel a strange, hollow ache in their bones. They would tell stories of the big green, who was too mean for even Gork and Mort to handle. But the Hulk was not dead. Somewhere in the cold, dark heart of that nebula, a mass of hyperdense, jade muscle drifted in a state of stasis, his heart beating once every 100 years. He was a sleeping star, a permanent deterrent floating in the dark, waiting for the galaxy to grow loud enough to wake him again. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? Perhaps the answer lies in the silence that followed the explosion. For a brief moment, the constant war of the 41st millennium was interrupted by a sense of awe. The Emperor on his throne, the Chaos Gods in their pits, and the Xenos in their hives all looked at the empty space where a world once stood and understood a singular truth. Rage is a fire that eventually consumes its own fuel. The Hulk had found his peace, not by being cured, but by becoming the very void he had always sought. He was the strongest there was, the strongest there is, and now he was all that was left of the light,